So my first question is, why did you want to run the Colorado Statesman in the first place? Was this a lifelong dream or something you fell into or thought you could make a larger impact with?
Well, as I mentioned, it was absolutely just falling into it. You know, no, it wasn't a lifelong dream, but I feel like it's a dream job at this point. I've been having an absolute blast, partially because it keeps me politically involved, but I don't have to be at the heart of the politics. Thankfully, I'm not in the pages anymore with the hard-hitting journalism, some of it that was much deserved. Um, so, no, it's been great. It was honestly a coincidence.
What would you like the Colorado Statesman to be known for? What would you like its legacy to be under your direction?
I would like to continue to be known for the next 100 years as the fair publication. The publication gives both sides a fair shake, that does the research, and it doesn't have a bias. So many, and I'll mention this, so many publications now, and I won't name names, but there are a number in Colorado, are so desperate for funds that they look to political funding to make budget. And the Statesman has never, since we were the Colorado Democrat, we have never, for the last 60 years, gone down that road. And I'm proud that the former publisher chose not to go down that road, and I can say that I'll probably close the doors before I would go down that road. There are enough of those biased news sources that have an agenda because of where their funding comes from and from who's calling the shots in Washington. So I'm pleased to be, again, that fair and balanced, I don't want to use fair and balanced, that's the Fox News thing, that non-biased news source.
Given the contentious and vitriolic environment that politics can be, are there any personal topics of one's life do you think that should be, off the public domain?
Well, anyone that knows my background, and I think it's probably still one of the top 4 hits if you Google my name, and I'm going to see you all bring your smartphones out there now. But there are people make stupid choices, and I'm one of them. I made mistakes specifically when I was younger. If you run for office, you better count on the fact that every one of those things is going to be on public display, and it should be. Now, there are some things that I think that because of just the way that human beings have gotten in terms of sort of the vitriol of politics that are really saddening. For example, and I'm not a Ted Cruz supporter. For those of you who are, I'm sorry, I'm just not. But the attacks on Ted Cruz daughters, by a cartoonist, by the way, was shameful. And it's just the way that news media is in politics now. It is a cutthroat, full contact sport. But bringing people's families into it, talking about some of the things that are talked about now, again, going back 60 years in the pages of the Statesman, you would never find something like that. It's a very different environment today in politics than it was even 10 years ago. So be prepared for it. Number one, if you're running for office, be prepared for it. Make sure your family is prepared for it, because every one of us has made, probably not as dumb of some of the mistakes I've made, but every one of us have made mistakes, right? And they're going to come out and they'll be on display for the world to see. That said, I support 100% the First Amendment. And I think it's more important to protect the First Amendment than it is to try to scale any of that back when it comes to public servants and candidates running for office.
I ran for office a number of years ago, and I can attest firsthand that they will make it up and lie and whatever, but anything is public domain. But don't be discouraged for not running and hopefully serving in some way. So with that, let's open it up for the audience for questions. John?
Jared, talk a little bit about those unaffiliated. I'm surprised that it's so low in subscribers to the Statesman. And specifically, there was a study that Stanford came out that I think the New York Times reported on about a year ago that said unaffiliated or nonpartisan folks, unregistered, registered as unaffiliated, are actually more partisan. They hate the Republicans if they're leaning Democratic, nonpartisan Democratic. They hate Republicans more, and the opposite. Can you talk a little bit about where society's going, since more people are registering as unaffiliated than they
So the question by John is for the unaffiliated voters. He was surprised that it was at that percentage, and where are their trend lines in terms of where they're going and leaning towards?
Well, I'm an unaffiliated voter myself. I should point that out. As a long-time Republican, since I was able to register to vote, I made the decision to go unaffiliated because I think both parties are wrong about 90% of the time. And I think that's the frustration level, not quite as high as mine because I'm sort of a political addict and I enjoy it. But so many people are frustrated to the degree that they become unaffiliated and they don't want to have anything to do with it. They are hitting they're unfriending people on Facebook anytime they go political. They don't want to hear it. And I think that's to a large extent why you see that amongst our readership, because that's all we are. We're political. We don't have a sports section. We don't have a crime beat. We don't have a business section. We're politics. So I think it is that sort of you're unaffiliating and separating yourself from politics as a whole.
Good for society?
I think it's a terrible thing for society. I think partially we're all responsible. Specifically those that work in politics in campaigns are responsible because we've gotten it to such a cutthroat level that makes people disgusted to turn on the TV and have to watch the political ads during election season. So no, I think we're all sort of at fault, but people have to get engaged again. For those of you that may have read Bowling Alone, that was a book that I had to read in college. Great book. The reason it's called Bowling Alone is because it analyzes specifically these groups or social organizations like the bowling clubs that existed in the 50s and 60s, where people came together like we all are tonight and socialized and learned from one another and discussed politics and discussed the important things that were happening in their community, much of it political. It's not happening. Now we're sitting on Facebook and we're lobbing these hyper-partisan bombs at each other and getting disgusted, right? So.
I'm surprised you're having such an issue with that, because you did say politics was a full contact sport, so you would think the readership would go up from that perspective. Tim, you have a question?
This will be a little bit of a takeoff on John's, but to drill down. By the way, love the Statesman, and Jody was the right person for many years there, but I think you're definitely the right person in that job now, so we wish you the best of luck. Like to see the changes. Last night's President's State of the Union message and an anti-terrorism response, they both bemoan this drills down on what John Braxton was leading up to, but to get to a specific, the localized animosity in politics. And it was cited about, or it was alleged that members of Congress make their own districts and they make them safe. I think Mike Kaufman would argue that. I don't think he considers his district very safe. So what do you think, though, on the redistricting that is proposed or recommended anyway by some to alleviate the animosity of politics and to stir up the congressional districts in the redistricting process?
So for those that don't know, Tim is the head of the Colorado Auto Dealers Association, and he spoke last month at the Opportunity Coalition. So thanks for coming back as a guest. We appreciate that. The question was with regards to congressmen in terms of redistricting to protect themselves. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a tale as old as time, number one, right? I mean, the gerrymandering process, the redistricting process, and you're always going to have someone that tries to change the rules up enough to their advantage. Tim, I'm not going to, I think it's a phenomenal question, and it's one that we're going to have playing out in our pages and online, and we're going to do a lot of coverage on it. So I'm not going to comment on my particular opinion just because, we are going to cover both sides, and that is a state issue. But I think, it's another political problem, right? You have politicos, campaign managers, advisors, senior staff that are willing to strike below the belt, try to change the rules because not enough of us are paying attention and they think they can get away with it.
Did you all just witness that for a second? That's why this guy's readership has gone up from 8,000 to 58,000. Did you see it's going to play out in the pages of his paper? And by the way, you can get it in print form or you can get it, in social media. He's good, isn't he? I think it just went up again. We're going to play that whole thing out. Sorry, I had to point that out. Phil, and we'll get right to you in a second, Joe. Phil?
Jared, had a chance to
So for those that don't know Phil, he's the former mayor of Littleton, so thank you for joining us. The question is with regards to, saw a panel with 5 of the former governors, and some being optimistic and pessimistic, and I would reframe that instead of the democratic experiment, the constitutional republic experiment, but that's just me, and how does he think that's going for us?
Well, that's a great question. You know, for those of you in the room that are on a board for a political action committee, my cell phone's right there. We do sell political advertising, so no, I mean it's really a catch-22 for a business like mine, right? Because we like to see political advertising revenue, but on a personal level, I think many would be surprised what my opinion is on that, and that's that there's too little in terms of I don't want to say regulations, but there aren't any checks and balances. We haven't struck the right balance in terms of how funding works, and specifically this dark money that we have so much of. There's no accountability, right? And I'm in the news business. We're supposed to prop up transparency, and there isn't a whole lot of that right now in that specific field. So a hard answer for a publisher, again, of a newspaper, but yeah, I think there is a problem.
It's interesting there's not more transparency in an environment we hear so much about politics all the time. Isn't that interesting when you think about it? Joe, you've been very patient. I'll get to you in just a moment. Yes? You had a question a moment ago?
Yeah. So it kind of piggybacks on his question. You talked about being a staunch defender of the First Amendment, and with the Citizens United ruling, which brought in all this money and dark money. I mean, I feel like, and I'm an unaffiliated voter as well, is that it's no longer we the people, it's we the special interest money. It's taken over, and I think politicians get in there with good intentions, but they're like NASCAR drivers, right? They're bought and paid for by their sponsorships. And what are your feelings around the whole Citizens United and all that dark money? If you could elaborate a little bit more on top of what his question was.
The question was elaboration a little bit more in terms of campaign funding and specifically Citizens United.
Well, again, I'm going to break with my former political party and say that there's a need for some checks and balances in that area of statute. I don't have the answers there, and frankly, you get an army of attorneys on either side that craft the answers, and you end up with oftentimes more problems. Right? This is why people are frustrated. I've got to stop. I'm going down the wrong path here. I'm creating more unaffiliateds who are not going to read my newspaper, but no, I mean it is frustrating, and it's something that we cover on a regular basis. Has a nexus at least with Citizens United. So, I mean, yeah, I could talk with you for hours on that topic and get very theoretical on it, but there's clearly a problem that needs to be fixed, and people on both sides of the aisle need to address it.
I agree. You have a question back there? Are you in PLC?
Yep.
Okay, whew, good. So I was in PLC, and we have an open invitation for the President's Leadership class at CU. It's one of the best programs I ever went through, and so I'm glad I had to ask, because you said it was at the university. So she is a young journalism student and is asking for recommendations in terms of how to get started in the political world or some process in general.
Well, first let me say that I have more respect now working for this newspaper over the last little over a year for journalists than I ever did before. And journalists aren't exactly looked up to. They're kind of classified maybe a little bit ahead of an attorney at this point, or a politician. But the reality is the journalists that work for me are extremely committed to their work. I mean, they're passionate beyond any other type of career that I've seen, and that's the reason that they're willing to take $30,000 a year for the rest of their lives to do what they love, right? It's not the industry to get into if you want to get wealthy. But if you're passionate, which I'm sure you are, you wouldn't have gotten into journalism. I think you're going to do great things. You can take a lot of pride in going out there and winning a lot of different awards. Maybe one day you'll win a Pulitzer. And it feels good if you do it right, and you don't take the bait that both sides are trying to give you to insert their agendas into your coverage. That would probably be my biggest point of advice, is just, stay true to that objective nature of your reporting. And there's a whole argument now, and you're probably learning this in college, that, is there anything truly objective? Because we all have our own biases when we write, and that's true as well. I would say focus more on transparency. Tell people what leanings you have, if you have any, up front before you show them what you've just written. I think you're going to see more and more of that in this industry as we go forward.
As a business owner, I want to encourage you as well. I'm obviously not in the industry, but I appreciate journalists who give good quality information, helps us make good decisions, and also those who tell the true story in terms of getting our word out. So I encourage you in that process. We're very proactive towards journalists in that regard. Yes, we'll come back to you. The question is, other than the Colorado Statesman, what would you enjoy reading on a daily basis?
Curious George, Sesame Street, My Little Pony, the names go, with a 4-year-old daughter. When I have some downtime, I still enjoy picking up the New York Times. I enjoy the Atlantic. I won't name a competitor that I actually read, but and that's on the news end. In terms of fiction, I'm a huge fan of fiction literature. My favorite, I'll just give you a sense of sort of my style, I guess, if you will. My favorite novel, sort of humor novel, is Confederacy of Dunces. A hilarious book if you've never read it. It's just, you'll catch yourself laughing out loud. So, no, I'm an avid reader. I read really anything I can get my hands on. I've had to catch myself a little bit more not doing as much of it, because in the news business you're working 24/7, and I probably read more of our stuff than anything else. But when I'm not watching Sesame Street, I'll pick that up.
Great. And you had a question?
It's easy. What restaurants and bars host the most intense political scene in Colorado?
What restaurants and bars host the most intense political scene in Colorado?
Well, this might be a trick question, because one of my pages had an advertisement on it that is a really politically engaged bar, but it's Capitol Cigars, and they try to cast themselves. They're just a few blocks from the Capitol. They have a lot of legislators and staffers that go in there on a regular basis, so you can pick up some interesting conversations. You can get in on some interesting conversations over there, or eavesdrop. Brown Palace too. Churchill's. Talk about the smoke-filled rooms. You go into Churchill's, right? You've got the cigar smoke and the guys drinking. A lot of times those are from the Capitol building, and I can say that from personal experience. It's just where everyone goes to let their hair down. So another good place to go pick up some interesting conversations. Yep.
Do you send some of your journalists there? I don't know if he's going to answer that. Oh, they're all undercover. You'll never know. Exactly. So you had a question?
I was just kind of curious. I mean, first of all, you just went fascinated, and the information you're talking about is so interesting. But if somebody wanted to become like a CEO or to move up in companies, especially like in the media things you're talking about, how does one do that? How do you move up in your company?
So the young gentleman who's asking that question, he's a student at DU, and his family is very involved in business and construction in India. So thank you for asking the question. The question is, if you wanted to move up in that world and regard, how would you go about doing so?
Keep pushing forward. Take all of the missteps in stride. Keep pushing forward. I mean, we're all going to, again, make mistakes. I've made my fair share. I feel privileged to have been elected to the House of Representatives and sat in one of those chairs of one of only 65 people. Consider it an honor. I would never want to do it again. 2 years was enough, but follow your dreams. Number one. In my case, by the way, I wouldn't say so much the Renaissance man. One of my staff wrote that up, and I think they went a little overboard. I'm good at a lot of things, maybe not great at anything, but I followed a number of different dreams. I've gone down a whole bunch of different paths, and this happens to be where I'm at in my life. Frankly, I'm in a position, I love this job. I'd do it for another 50 years at this point. So, do what your heart leads you to do, and I think you'll be successful.
Let's take a couple of more questions. I've been leaning on this side, but Charlie, you raised your hand so quick, I have to do it. So no, go ahead. I want to hear your question. So Charlie is with Alpine Banks. If you don't know them, they just moved here to the Front Range. And his question is, in the coming year, what are some of the more contentious issues that will be coming forth?
So for the state, two big issues are going to be the ballot initiative for building a better Colorado and the ballot initiative for beer and wine in grocery stores. Specifically the second one, because it's a little bit more of a sexy issue, right, is going to be a lot of fun to watch play out. It's a David and Goliath battle. There's huge money on the grocery store side and not so much on the mom and pop shop side. Regardless of what side you fall on, it's going to be really, small business versus big business in the state of Colorado, and watching that play out is going to be interesting. Probably expected me to say the presidential race. Of course, that's going to be huge. For my publication, though, it's going to be those state issues. The Senate race is going to be interesting. We, have some candidates in that I think on the Republican side it'll be an interesting primary. And I do say primary. I think it will be a primary. And you've got Senator Bennett defending his seat. It's going to be fun to watch. So those are going to be some of the key issues. And then, of course, we love the local stuff, too, down to the state rep seats, county commission seats. You get some really interesting people that run for these offices sometimes, and it makes for great news.
Were you all aware there's a presidential election this year? Did you know that? Okay, I didn't know. Besides, no. Luke, I have a question. Sorry, I had to put that out there.
Subscription rate growth was incredible. I mean, hats off to you in the time frame of how you did that. At what point, you mentioned something that was very specific, because I was just home in Michigan for Christmas, and you had all the kids sitting around on their iPads, and everyone else is sitting around on their phones, and then you have my 73-year-old mother opening up the newspaper and reading it. In your mind, at what percentage, say that 68,000 subscribers that you have, just say it stays even, at what point do you see you're only printing to 5% of that population instead of a larger percent of that population?
So Luke's question is with regards to demographics and who's actually reading print media versus online, and at what point is that trend going to be changing even more so than it already has, basically?
Yeah, I mean, you're really getting into some theory, media theory, really. I mean, there's no way, no one has found, the magic reading glasses to figure out how to read the trends on this. And I think print's going to continue to decline just naturally. You have a generation that will slowly pass away, and you have people that, like my daughter, that I don't let her spend much time in front of a tablet or a phone, but just enough so she's there, right? So she has the skills, because you're going to have an entire generation. My generation, I'm 33. I bought my first cell phone when I was 17, so most of my childhood I didn't have tablets or smartphones. You have a generation coming up now that's all they're going to know, and that's what they're going to expect to read on. And I think that technology is going to continue to get extremely advanced, where you at some point, I mean, there are prototypes out there for digital papers. So I think there will be a different way of reading news in that way, where you've got a flexible screen that you're reading on that sort of mimics what an old newspaper was. So the opportunities are endless, but I do think print, if that is your question, I think print will continue to decline with that passing generation.
Let's take one last question. I want to be respectful to everybody's time this evening. Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious to know how you can run an unbiased newspaper. I don't know if you interview each one of the writers and see, because I show my children all the time in newspapers how extreme, but when I'm talking about the other side, I'm talking about moderate, whether it's gun rights or whatever, but you can obviously see biasness in everything you do, and I didn't know if that was your role as publisher, is to go, whoa, 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 come in here, son. You can't add that.
So the question is, how can you truly run a unbiased newspaper, and as part of your role, helping to curtail some of the bias that may exist?
Well, the truth is, story to story, you can't, because you're absolutely right. Everyone, and as I mentioned to the young lady who's a journalist, everyone has some type of bias, from their life experience, even if it's not political, just from a life experience. So you can't story to story. What the Statesman, I think, has done so well for so long is that they balance it out. They have writers from both slants and everywhere in between. I'm proud to have an editor, Ernest Lunning, who does an incredible job in terms of, the Republicans thinks he's a Republican, the Democrats think he's a Democrat, and that's a sign of a good reporter, because he has sources on both sides. He's fair to both sides are willing to talk to him. Having someone at the helm, and that, to answer your question, that's not me, that's the editor, and he does a great job of that. What he'll do is he'll take his writers' stories. Some of them come from a little bit more liberal slant, some from a conservative slant, somewhere in between, and he'll make sure that there's balance in the 24 pages or 16 pages of a weekly issue, and same on our website. Might not even be the same week, maybe a week later. We just make sure that we follow up with something with a little bit different twist, different perspective.
So instead of "Where's Waldo," we're going to have "Where's Ernest." Sorry, just had to put that out there. Politically, of course. Let's give Jared a round of applause.